Hi guys, I'm just another guy named James, and today I'm going to be talking about Batman Year 3. Now, Batman Year 3 is a story kind of in a somewhat similar vein to the very obviously similarly named Batman Years 1 and 2. Batman Year 3, though, is more notable because most of the story actually happens in the present day, not in Batman Year 1 and Batman Year 2. Both were notably stories taking place entirely in the past. And this story is written by Marv Wolfman, drawn by Pat Broderick. Unlike the other Batman stories that I've talked about here on the channel, honestly, it's a pretty good little story. It heavily features Nightwing and Batman and some of their at the time current dynamics. I say at the time because obviously this is a fairly old story being published in either 1990 or 1989. And honestly, it is pretty good. It's a quick little four-part story released in 1990, and it really heavily features the follow-up to the death of Jason Todd and Death in the Family. It's kind of the first story to really address that after the actual storyline. This story rolled straight out of a Batman story by John Byrne and Jim Aparo, and that had parlayed from a couple of one-shot issues that took place immediately that were released immediately after Death in the Family. So that's probably the biggest piece of context that you're going to want to have going into this is at this time in comics history. Nightwing is on his own. He lives in New York. He's a member of the Teen Titans. That's like his full-time gig. And Jason Todd has died. Jason Todd has just recently died, and Batman is still kind of reeling from the loss of Jason Todd. And that's kind of where our story starts from. Is Batman and Nightwing are separated. Batman's reeling from the death of Jason Todd. Nightwing has gotten used to being on his own. So that's kind of where we enter the picture. One of the interesting things about this Batman Year 3 story is you get the origin this is really kind of delineates the post-crisis origin of Robin, of Dick Grayson's Robin, pretty much down to a T. And yeah, it's a pretty good story. And honestly, I think that is just about enough lead-in. So I'm actually going to just hop straight into our story, which today opens on Batman, who is overlooking a pier trying to get clues on how to end a violent gang war that is currently tearing through Gotham. And as Batman looks over the pier, he sees a news chopper fly over a mob boat, causing Batman to jump into action because he knows the news chopper is a fake. A theory that is confirmed when the chopper guns down everyone on the boat. Batman then launches a harpoon into the chopper and starts climbing the rope to get to the criminals, but due to some evasive flying, Batman is forced to jump down into the Gotham River. We then cut away to the Gotham Municipal Court, where we see a parole hearing for a Mr. Anthony Zuko. And for now, all we know is that he is a murderer, and we see that there is one man who is still testifying against him to keep him from being paroled. But before we see who it is, we jump to Wayne Manor, where we see Dick Grayson has come home to speak to Bruce Wayne about the death of Jason Todd. But Batman's gone because it's the night. But as Dick Grayson, Nightwing, explores the mansion and the Batcave, he sees that all traces of Jason Todd have been removed. All the traces of him living in the manor, and all traces of him as being Robin from the cave. And and that kind of worries Dick. He's worried about how Batman is able to handle this loss, and it seems to be a worry that's fairly well justified. We then cut back to the courthouse where we see the mystery man begin his testimony against Anthony Zuko, telling you Zuko's past, how his parents were murdered by criminals who were doing a protection racket, and the parents refused to pay, leading Zuko to end up in the Gotham orphanage. And he is completely blinded by a need for vengeance and power. Later on, in his teens, in his teen/young adult life, he murders the gangsters who killed his family, and then he begins a life of crime. He's a true tough guy, and he records everything that's going on, every criminal activity he sees, he records in a book. We then see the man giving his testimonial switch his story over from Anthony Zuko to one of his victims, to the boy Dick Grayson. And the witness explains how, as a boy, Dick lived at the circus with his parents. And we see that the circus truly was his family, not just a group of performers who were all there together. But one day, Dick was near the owner's suite, and he overheard the owner of the circus being shaken down for protection money by Zuko. But the owner refuses to pay Zuko. So later that very same evening, during the show, the Flying Graysons, Dick's family, his parents, during their performance, we see the trapeze snaps, sending Dick's parents plummeting to their death right in front of their son. And we then see Batman arrive on the scene, and he talks to Dick, saying that he will catch Zuko and bring him to justice. We then see Dick is sent to the Gotham orphanage, the very same as Zuko. But instead of bristling when asked about forgiving or asked about vengeance, he is softened to the none that is present. And for now, that's where Alfred Pennyworth ends his testimonial, encouraging the board to leave Zuko to rot in prison. Back in the Batcave, we see Dick suit up as Nightwing and go out after Batman, because he believes that Bruce may have gone crazy, maybe legitimately insane, reeling from the death of Jason Todd. We then see Batman, who is staking out a gangland mansion that is about to be attacked, and when he sees the helicopter flying in, he jumps in to warn the gangs before the mansion is completely destroyed by a burst of rocket fire. We then cut away to Nightwing, who is following the same trail of evidence as Batman, speaking to the same suspects, and Nightwing is horrified by how sloppy and messy Bruce has gotten since the death of Jason. Nightwing then heads to the very same mansion that was just destroyed, and once he gets there, he starts digging through the rubble looking for Batman. But when he eventually finds Batman more or less blows Nightwing off and goes back to the mansion. Back to the mission. We then cut back to Wayne Manor, on Alfred Pennyworth, where he learns that Zuko is going to be paroled. And Alfred is thrown backwards into a wave of memory, starting when Bruce made Dick his ward, and the day after Dick was taken to Wayne Manor. And we see Alfred explain why Bruce chose Dick, explaining that Bruce was at the circus that day and that the Wayne family was also slain by criminals. So Bruce sees a lot of himself in Dick. And after Bruce and Dick formally meet, Dick mentions that he wants to make Zuko face justice. And Bruce offers to teach him the proper way to do so, and he takes him down into the Batcave. Batman then extended the offer to Dick to join his crusade for justice, an offer that Dick accepted, and the two began to train physically, mentally, with Bruce constantly reminding him that they're crime fighters, not brutalizers, investigators, not thugs. We're then brought back to the present as Batman and Nightwing both arrive at Wayne Manor, but Bruce is still giving Nightwing the cold shoulder, leading Dick down a path of memory, beginning on his first night as Robin, remembering how he and Batman put pressure on Zuko's criminal organization, an organization that we see was already shaky due to Zuko's book of his log of criminal activity, excluding his own, of course. But Nightwing remembers how he and Bruce put only enough pressure on Zuko to frighten him, not trying not to do anything else. But now Bruce is losing himself. He's too lost and raptured up in his emotions. So Dick leaves Alfred, who he has been explaining all this to, and he goes to confront Batman. But Batman is gone. We then cut away to a scene of several crime families sharing a meal together to discuss the gangland killings. And we see Batman sneak in to offer to work with the mob to help catch the gangland killer. We then cut to the Gotham City jail, where we see that for some reason Zuko has chosen this exact moment to be freed. And he was able to choose the moment because he has dirt on one of the members of the parole board. We then cut away to Nightwing, who was tearing through the city on his bike, and he thinks to himself, "He raised me to think, but he's not thinking anymore. He taught me the importance of justice, but lately he hasn't been just. He was like a father to me, and I loved him. And though he could never bring himself to say it, I know he loved me too. I feel like the child of an alcoholic. You know the problem isn't yours, but it is. You want to help, but you don't know how. So you lie awake at night in fear and confusion and nothing gets resolved. I'm not sure, but I think Bruce is going crazy. And I'm lost, not knowing what to do. I've heard it all before. My God, even Starfire sometimes thinks Bruce has been crazy for years. I know he's obsessed with his parents' death. I know he may be cold and sometimes uncaring, but I also know he's always in control. Or he was. Until Jason died. He never called to tell me. I don't think he told anyone. But he removed all of Jason's memorabilia from the Batcave, as if that could erase his memory. We then see that Commissioner Gordon is at the most recent crime scene of the gangland killings and is giving a press release about the killing, while Nightwing collects some evidence as he works with a detective from the Gotham City Police Department. And he finds a silk filament, which is from a parachute, and a fingerprint on a shard of glass. We then cut away from Nightwing, and we see Batman, who is still in his standoff against all the crime families of Gotham, and they don't seem like they have it in them to work with Batman. Down in the Batcave, we see Nightwing use the computer to track down the fingerprints, and he learns that they belong to someone who works for a shell company. But Nightwing is for now unable to learn who owns the corporation. Alfred is also there, and he's trying to get up the courage to tell Nightwing that Anthony Zuko has been paroled. Back with the gang families, we see Batman kick some butt before he pulls one of the mobsters' guns and strong-arms them into working together. Again, showing how Bruce really has kind of gone off the deep end, because that's not in his character to do. And the crime families begin naming all the suspects for him, because they kind of figure it has to be someone well connected with a lot of allegiance to whoever they're working for, and with a lot of resources. So Batman thinks, it's probably one of the crime families, but all of the active crime families are represented. So the gangsters then begin telling Batman about the inactive families, mentioning a few others, but they mention Zuko's name. and Batman is flooded by a wave of memory of how he and Robin worked together to take down and intimidate Zuko. The families also tell Batman about Zuko's book. It is then revealed to the group that Zuko is being released the very next day. That Batman then goes and strong arms part of Zuko's old crew who snitches on him. At the same time, Nightwing follows his lead, the shell company, to Zuko's identity. Then Alfred is able to break through to Dick and tell him that Zuko is being paroled in the morning. Nightwing then goes to the jail and he finds Batman sitting in the Batmobile. So he sits with them and they wait for Zuko. Inside the jail, we see Zuko walk out, saying he's going to start running organized crime in Gotham using the book as leverage against everyone he has intel on, including the guy from the parole board, who had bribed a judge years earlier. But as soon as Zuko walks out of the jail, he's shot dead by a helicopter. Nightwing then accuses Batman of being party to the murder of Zuko, because again, Nightwing truly believes that Batman has gone fully off the deep end. But Batman denies it, and he's about to open up to Dick about something or other about like his about the extent to which he's mourning the loss of Jason Todd, but he retreats instead. He removes himself from the situation. And as Batman drives back to the Batcave, we see Taft, the man from Zuko's parole board, the one who bribed the judge, and he announces on TV that Zuko's book is missing. But he also reveals that the book has info on all of the crime families of Gotham, and he's doing this as a way to get as many eyes looking for the book as possible so that he can steal it. Batman is then able to deduce that, and that's kind of what Batman is able to deduce. Batman then leaves the Batcave so that he can track down some clues to get to the book. But when Nightwing offers to work with him, Batman rejects him, seemingly being afraid to lose Nightwing in the same way that he lost his last Robin. Nightwing then is thrown back into his memories of the hearing that Bruce had to undergo before Dick could become his ward, because billionaire playboy isn't exactly a great fit to adopt a child, and Bruce basically just had to explain why he wanted to raise Dick, why he wanted to help him. And Bruce basically just explained that he wanted to make Dick his ward because he knows he's familiar with the pain that Dick is going through. And he wants to give Dick a better life than what he had. He wants to make sure he has someone who can care for him, someone to make sure that that Dick Grayson didn't become Bruce Wayne. We then cut back to the present, where we see Batman putting some force tactics on one of Zuko's men, and he seems to have been given a pretty decent lead. So Batman leaves and he goes to the crime families, and he tells them to forget about the book, or he will be personally brutalizing the heads of each family if there is any trouble in the streets. Later, we see Nightwing also get some info on the book from one of Zuko's men, and he is able to piece together that Zuko hid the ledger at the orphanage where they were both raised, which is being torn down later that month. We then see that Taft was eavesdropping, and he is also heading to the orphanage. When Nightwing arrives on the scene, he finds the nun who helped raise him, and she tells him that she saw Zuko go into the bell tower at the orphanage after his turn to crime, but before he was arrested. Nightwing then goes up to the tower and finds the book, but Taft tries to kill him for it. But Nightwing is able to dodge enough for the blow to not be fatal, but he still does get hit. At the same moment, Batman shows up at the bottom of the tower, and he is able to see Dick getting beat up until Nightwing is able to just kick Taft off of him. But Taft makes one final lunge for the book, which causes him to fall out of the window, ending his life. And that's more or less where the story ends today. There is a brief epilogue of Alfred and Nightwing in the Batcave being like, yeah, that was, oh, we lost the book, all the pages fell out, and the rain washed the ink off the pages. Well, that's a shame anyway, and that's kind of, and then, we see a brief scene of Dick Grayson visiting his parents' grave. It's a very kind of somber ending, nothing really gets truly was resolved, but honestly, this story is overall just a pretty good one, but a very odd one. Because, it's called Batman Year 3, and you kind of think of that, it's going to be like a follow-up to Batman Year 1. Or, I guess, technically a follow-up to Batman Year 2, which is the follow-up to Batman Year 1. And Year 1 was this really kind of tense story, all set entirely in the past of Batman's character, and it really worked because of that being fully set in the past. Really did serve as an advantage to it. But in this story, the story of the present is really interesting, and the flashbacks make it necessary. And I really like the story, but it's not what I would have wanted to see from a Batman Year 3. From the name of the comic, it's not what I would have wanted to see. But it is overall just a good story. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Although I personally, if I was DC Comics and I was publishing this at this time, this would not have been a Batman story. I would have published this as a standalone Nightwing limited series. Personally, just because, to me, Nightwing's the one. Nightwing really does carry this story. He's the one who's around. He's the one who we follow for most of the adventure. He's the one who's kind of there from the beginning. Batman doesn't actually do much. Nightwing is the one who figures it out. Who figures out the mystery, who he deduces the clues. I think it could have been a really interesting Nightwing limited series, and I think that at this time when Teen Titans was kind of hit its peak of popularity, I think that could have been a really interesting choice. And then I think it would have served really well in that sort of vein, especially because there was a ton of demand for a Nightwing series. So I think that could have been really interesting, and I think I could see a world where an early version of this plot and script was a Nightwing miniseries instead of a Batman story arc. But that's kind of just a conspiracy theory that I have. And maybe it's also because this is a story written by Marv Wolfman, who you probably know as the writer of Teen Titans, and of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and a lot of other stuff in the DC universe. But his arguably his longest run was on, one of his longer runs was on Teen Titans, where he wrote nearly, I think, 180 consecutive issues of Teen Titans. And obviously that very heavily featured Nightwing. So maybe that's where that impression comes from. But anyway, I'm digressing. Oh, the story's very good. I like the slight modernization of Dick Grayson's origin here. I think it really does work in the post-crisis continuity. Because one of the questions that you always run up against in Batman media is why is Robin there? Robin's so goofy. He doesn't really belong with Batman. That's why I think there's only really been one why Robin only appeared in Batman Forever and in Batman 66, not in any of the other Batman movies. Even though I think he would really fit into a lot of those universes pretty well. Because I think he plays the important role of Robin keeps Batman human. And I think that's a really interesting layer that they get that is definitely a part of Robin / Nightwing's character. And I like Nightwing because he's every bit the hero that Batman is, but without he doesn't have the drive of vengeance and justice as much as Bruce does. Because that can sometimes lead to, like dogmatic problems for Bruce Wayne. But I do think that overall, I think a lot of that groundwork is laid out in this series. One of the hard things about this series, though, is it opens. Dick Grayson wants to talk to Bruce Wayne about the death of Jason Todd. That conversation never happens. They never address it. Batman and Nightwing actually hardly interact in this story. They're both, for most of the adventure, they're following the same. They're getting to the same goal, but they're taking completely different routes around it. So they end up being separated for most of the story. And like I said earlier, we follow the Nightwing part more closely than we do the Batman part, which is interesting to me. But yeah, the story is just pretty good. Marv Wolfman's a good writer, and I think that's what a lot of my feedback comes down to. Pat Broderick, who's the penciler on this story, he's all right. I believe he was he either inked or penciled the Firestorm series of the early '80s, and I really liked his artwork in that. But in this, a lot of the drawings, while not bad, are just a little flat, and it's just not my favorite Batman art. But it's not as bad as, say, like a Kelly Jones or a Scott McDaniel. Like it's just not great artwork, which is hard for me, given that a lot of the other Batman stories that I've personally read have really good artwork. 10 Nights of the Beast with 10 Nights of the Beast and Death in the Family having that gorgeous narrative art by Jim Aparo. Batman Year One having that kind of nitty gritty Frank Miller, Klaus Janson style to it. Like a lot of the Batman stories that I've read just do have a higher level of artistry behind them, and this is by no means bad. The covers that I'm looking at here are definitely drawn by George Perez, which that would have been really interesting. Getting the entire Teen Titans team on a Batman story, that would have been very odd. But anyway, that's another what if type deal. Overall, I do think the story's good. It was adapted really well into an episode of Batman the Animated Series, or I guess it's 2 episodes called Robin's Reckoning. I do think that is arguably better, like quite a bit better than this. But this is still very good. This gets its 3 main characters right. And I do very much so respect it for that. It gets Alfred, Nightwing, and Batman all correctly, and it really does nail the dynamics between all of those characters. So I do like it a lot for that. Yeah, honestly, I think that's all I've got to say on this one. So yeah, Batman Year 3. I believe they're coming out with a trade paperback of it this year for the first time ever, as a standalone story. So if you can find it, I'd highly recommend it. It is pretty good, definitely worth a read, and honestly, it is a pretty good follow-up to Batman Death in the Family. It's kind of the next stage of that story, and it's kind of the first Batman comics to really address the death of Jason Todd after it happened. But yeah, I think that is just all I have to say on the story for real this time. And so, yeah. So I'm just another guy named James. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.